I want to talk about a tweet that I posted just this morning. So I wrote in the tweet, nobody ends up in hell because they thought too hard about theology and ended up with the wrong answer. One more time, nobody ends up in hell because they thought too hard about theology and ended up with the wrong answer. Let's talk about this. Now, the view that you could face judgment and even damnation for thinking hard about a doctrine and ending up with a wrong answer, with a heretical or heterodox opinion, that was a view that was deeply, I would say, drilled into me growing up within the conservative evangelical church, but I think it's wrong. Let me say a couple problems I see with that view, which I was trying to address, albeit rather briefly, within the tweet. So first of all, I think this kind of view that you could lose your salvation, essentially, you could be judged punitively simply for thinking hard and carefully about your beliefs. I think this is predicated on what is often an evangelical and fundamentalist reductionism, which tends to view cognitive assent to particular doctrines as the bedrock, most important thing about Christianity, often at the expense of other significant factors like sacrament and liturgy, growth in spiritual disciplines, and the demonstration of spiritual fruit. Second, I think this view tends to value cognitive assent to doctrines over something which I think is even more important, and that's the cultivation of epistemic virtue. Simply believing the right doctrines as dictated by a tradition that you've been given, it misses potentially some very important things. You know, in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge, we talk about the idea of knowledge as having three components. There is belief. You have to believe something in order to know it. There has to be truth. The belief has to be true. But also there has to be justification or warrant present. Now, there's an enormous debate about each one of these terms and concepts within epistemology. But the basic idea is simply this, that it's not just enough to have a true belief. You have to have a right relationship to the belief. There has to be a proper ground, warrant, justification, reason on which you hold the belief. And if not, then you've got a substandard belief and potentially you do not have knowledge of it at all, even if it is true. Now, with that in mind, if somebody values and prioritizes simply assent to truth, as understood by the tradition one has received, if they value that over the pursuit of reasons, warrant, justification, evidence, grounds for the belief, the potential is that you've subverted, essentially, epistemic virtue in favor of simple cognitive assent. Imagine, for example, that you encourage people simply believe the doctrine of the Trinity or the Incarnation or the resurrection, but don't think about the doctrine, don't research it, because you might end up losing your faith in the doctrine. But that is not the way of epistemic virtue. That is rather epistemic sloth. I would submit that as cowardice. We're called not simply to have right beliefs, but to have those right beliefs for the right reasons. And that includes, among other things, the tireless and fearless pursuit of truth in all things, and the pursuit of the grounds, reason, warrant, evidence that one might have or not have for the beliefs that they profess or that they've been told to profess. To think critically about the beliefs you hold in and of itself can never be a grounds for punishment, because that is the very act of taking those beliefs seriously, of valuing them, and of demonstrating your commitment to them, that you have invested this time and intellectual strength and energy, and potentially placing those very beliefs at risk because you value them so much. So I think it is fundamentally wrong-headed when people believe that you could be punished, nay, you could lose your salvation itself, simply in virtue of having thought hard about the very beliefs that you profess to value. Having said that, it is always possible that, for example, our pursuit of warrant or justification, reason, evidence, and our attempt to take those beliefs seriously may, at many points, be beset with cognitive biases. And maybe we end up losing a particular belief, not because we were simply virtuously seeking to understand the belief better, but rather because we had particular biases emerging that skewed our assessment of the data and ended up leading us to reject the belief, not for good grounds, but rather because of those biases. In a case like that, you may well be culpable for bias exercised within your belief. So I'm not claiming, and I don't think we should ever think, that simply abandoning a belief when you think in the moment that you've done your duty, that doesn't necessarily exonerate you. It doesn't mean you necessarily did exercise epistemic virtue. But I would also say the opposite as a caution. Abandoning a belief, even a belief that is held to be important or central by a particular community, does not of itself mean relative to that community, let's say the Christian community, that you are now culpable if you did, in fact, simply exercise epistemic virtue.